Section 2.7 is about displaying data with bar graphs. So you see bar graphs all the time in newspapers, on websites, in magazines. Um, Bar graphs are typically used when data can be separated into categories and to compare the different categories. So here's an example. Parking attendant at a parking garage noted the types of vehicles parked there at a certain hour. So here's a bar graph that shows electric cars, pickups, sedans, SUVs, and hybrids, and how many of them were parked there during this 1 hour. So the thing to notice about this bar graph is that the categories are really important. In fact, you only want to use bar graphs when there are logical categories, when the data that you're dealing with falls into fairly natural categories. So what we mean by the categories here are what kind of vehicles that you're dealing with. Now, even on a thing like this, you might dispute that this is a good thing for a bar graph because you might see some difficulty deciding whether something was electric or hybrid, or whether something was a pickup or an SUV. But you pick your categories, and then you have axis labels. So axis labels are this and this. You want to make sure that the people looking at your bar graph can understand what you're trying to graph. So this is saying what type of car we had, and this one over here is telling us how many of them were parked in this parking garage at a certain hour. When you build a bar graph, there's a lot of things to think about. So here's an example. So suppose that your writing teacher graded the first set of papers for your class and wrote the following scores on the board. Construct a bar graph to display the data, make sure to mark the scale, and label each axis on the graph clearly. Give the graph a title. So you'll be doing this with an activity in class, so make sure you know how to think about how to build a bar graph, which is what we're talking about now. So here's this data that we have, and we want to display it on a bar graph, and you always have choices to make when you make a bar graph. Different people might build a different bar graph. So I'm going to take this data and show you, here's one possible way to display this data. So I have a title for the graph, writing paper scores, and then I have number of students over here, and down here are the scores. And so here at 54, one person got a 54, and so if you look out here, I have, this is really 55, 56, 57, 58, and so each one of these has one, except there were two people that had a 72, so that one came up here. So this isn't necessarily a bad way to do a bar graph. It shows you certain things. It shows you kind of how the different scores are distributed. There's a fair number kind of in that middle range between 65 and 78. There's another group way up high and a smaller group way down low. Nothing particularly wrong with this bar graph, but one that might be more relevant to me as a teacher is to do it this way. I don't know if you can read this very well, but same idea, writing paper scores. These are still scores down here, still number of students. But what I've done on this one is, this one says 50s on it, and this one says 60s, and this one says 90s. And so if you think about, those are categories that, since the thing that we're dealing with is scores on a paper, well, as a teacher, I break up A's, B's, C's, and D's by categories of, so A's are 90 and above, and B's are 80 to 89. And so these are really breaking into categories of A, B, so people that got A's on the paper, people that got B's, people that got C's, people that got D's, and people that got F's on the paper. So this is a natural category for me for scores because that's the way I split up my grades, and then that allows me to take this bar graph and look at it and say, oh well, most people got C's on this paper, some people got D's and F's and B's and A's, and I can actually see how many got each one by looking at the scale over on the side. So again, there's nothing wrong with the first graph. It shows different things. This shows me how does my class's grade distribution break out. So that this last graph that we just looked at, so how did I make that graph from the data we were given? So remember again, if this is hard for you to read, this says 50s down here, and on up 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So what I'm going to do is look for how many students. So I decided my categories first, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and then I'm going to look for, because my other axis is number of students, I'm going to look for how many people fit in that category. So for 50s, I'm going to look 1, 2, 3 fit in that category. So that's how I did a bar up here that went to 3 above the 50s. And then if I look at 60s, 1, 2, 3 more fell into that 60s category. So that made a same size bar. If I do 70s, here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those. So I draw my bar all the way up to 7. And on like that to 80s and 90s. So that's how you take a set of data. Now you notice, to make this easier to break up into categories, I rewrote the data in order. You don't really have to do that. You could do it from the data not being in order. This makes it a little quicker to do the counting if you write the data in order. So when you're making a graph, remember I sort of cheated making that graph because I had already decided what was this scale, that this scale went from 0 to 8. And I decided about these categories and explained to you why I was deciding on those categories. When you have a set of data and you're trying to make a graph from it, you have to look at, so to figure out this scale here, well, first I decide what I want my scale to be, that it's number of students. Then I decide what this scale is, that it's scores. Then I decide what my categories are, because in order to know what scale to put over here on this, I have to know what my categories down here are, because then I have to go back up and count and see, well, what's the maximum number I have? So I had 7 scores that were in the 70s, so I made my scale go up to 8 up here so that it would go just a little bit bigger than the tallest graph. No way I could have known what scale to put on there if I didn't look at my data, have already decided my categories, and then counted how many things wound up in each category. So what that means is when you're making a graph, use a pencil, think a little bit before you draw, sketch a couple of things, think about your categories, because you may try one category and then decide to try something else. Another quick note, this scale needs to be consistent. So once I started out deciding this was 0 to 8, this has to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It can't jump different amounts. And then your categories really need to be consistent. So 50s, that included a 10-point range, 50 through 59. And so therefore my next one was 60 through 69, and 70 through 79, and 80 through 89, and 90 through 99. I wasn't jumping all over the place and making different sized categories.